So believe it or not, CNN's Donnie O'Sullivan, I think he pronounces it Donnie O'Sullivan. He interviewed Hasan Piker in the wake of Kamala's loss. There was an actual Hasan Piker segment on CNN in the wake of Kamala's loss where they try to get his take, like, hey, why did she lose? So in other words, they're now acknowledging that there are lefty streamers and podcasters who get decent numbers because, of course, you know, the right sort of dominates the podcast space more generally, and Trump went on a whole bunch of podcasts that are either overtly right-wing or like non-political but lean right socially and culturally. You know, he went on Andrew Schultz's podcast and Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan, and you even had J.D. Vance went on Tim Dillon's show. And so this space, which is nominally non-political but certainly leans right, it led to the impression, man, this podcast base is just flat out right-wing. Democrats don't have the infrastructure to compete with it. And look, that's kind of bullshit, right? Because you're never going to get a left-wing space online that truly rivals the behemoth that is the right online, because there's so much big money backing the right online. And to be fair, when I say that, I'm thinking more of like, you know, the Daily Wires of the world. That's a massive operation that has massive funding from billionaires. And you have this like marriage of like the right-wing think tanks and this right-wing online media infrastructure. And then, of course, you have Rogan is an absolute behemoth. He didn't come up overtly political, but he's become more political over time. Of course, he has a massive multi-$100 million deal with Spotify, or at least he did. And whereas, look, on the Democratic side, the left, it's hard for the left to build out infrastructure like that because nobody would fund the left, because the left says we want to tax the corporations, right? We want billionaires and wealthy people to have less money, and we want to redistribute the wealth to the working class. And so you're not going to find an investor who's too keen on that idea. But having said that, given all of like the institutional biases against the left, there are, of course, outlets that are on the left, or there are individual podcasters or streamers who are on the left. Some of them a little more Democratic Party adjacent, like your Brian Tyler Cohens, for example. Some of them a little bit more outsiders, like your Hasan, for example. But it's interesting that now this is probably the first time that I've seen a genuine acknowledgement of, yeah, there actually is some Democratic media, some liberal media, and some left-wing media. So CNN went and spoke to Hasan Piker, and here we have not only what Hasan said, but the reaction from Bakari sellers, which is interesting to say the least. So let's watch, and then I'll break it down for you.
Hasan Piker is a social media superstar, really, with almost 3 million followers on the video streaming platform Twitch. He's a progressive fan of Bernie Sanders. So popular, Democratic Party invited him to the DNC in August, and he sat down with CNN's Donnie O'Sullivan.
And by the way, didn't he get kicked out? I think he got kicked out towards the end. Correct me if I'm wrong. Put it below.
Here's a little bit.
There's a general sense that when it comes to the world of podcasts, alternative media, I don't even know what you want to call it, that Trump did a much better job at that than Democrats and Harris.
Absolutely. I think that's true.
Harris did consider going on Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
But she didn't. What is it that the Democrat Party has to do differently?
Well, I think that they need to change their policies.
It's a policy thing.
Yes, it's 100% a policy thing. Which is the boring answer. Although it would be very self-serving for me to say, I'm the left's Joe Rogan, the Democratic Party should give me millions of dollars. That's not going to solve this problem. What will solve this problem is if the Democratic Party actually adopts real left-wing economic populist messaging instead of purposefully avoiding that stuff because they're terrified of upsetting their corporate donors. I think Trump speaks to male insecurities better, and I think Trump speaks to the anger that people have, whereas the other side of the political spectrum does not speak to that anger at all.
Joining us right now, CNN senior political commentator Bakari Sellers and Lance Trover, the former spokesperson for Doug Burgum when he was running in the Republican presidential primary. It's good to see you guys. Thank you. Bakari, what do you think of all that, what Hasan Piker was telling Donnie?
I wish he was paying attention. I mean, it's patently absurd to say that he wishes that Kamala Harris would adopt some populist economic policies. Was he talking about the fact that she wanted to build 3 million new homes with housing tax credits, or was he talking about the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit? I mean, the economic policies that she laid out were numerous, and she was the one who actually put forth policy plans. She put forth policy plans for African American males. She put forth policy plans for Hispanic voters. So, I mean, I find it really troubling when people want to have a policy discussion The fact is, more people know what was in Drake's lawsuit against UMG, and they've actually studied that more than they studied Kamala Harris's policy proposals on social media. So I don't really want to hear a conversation about she should have put forth more economic policy proposals when that was not the issue in this race at all.
Okay. Let me react to this. So on the overarching point, on the macro point, Hasan is completely correct, and I'll break that down in a second. There is a micro point here, though, where Bakari's not wrong. So Bakari's not wrong because there was a blind study that was done, and in that blind study, 80% of the voters preferred Kamala Harris's policies to Trump's policies, right? So this is not just about policy. It's not. It's not just about policy. Now, having said that, Hasan is right on the macro point for this reason, because what Hasan is saying is, look, you have to be in favor of the big, bold, populist policies, but you have to tie that together with a grand narrative of here are the villains and here are the good guys, and we're on the side of the good guys, and we're going to fight these villains to improve your life. And that's where the Democrats go wrong, is they are technocratic status quo managers. They're eggheads. They say, here's my list of policies. Take a look and tell me if you like it. And it's very like, it's like box checking type attitude, right? And that's not going to work, especially because voters just didn't believe Kamala, right? They didn't believe it. If you ask people, hey, what's Trump about? Trump, they say, oh, he's in favor of cracking down on immigration, right? Like there's an answer there. In Trump's conception of the world, you need to, for all of your problems, you need to blame immigrants, you need to blame trans people, you need to blame Hollywood and cultural elites and democratic elites. They are the cause of all of your problems, and I am going to fight for you and against them. So there's an answer, there's a story, there's a narrative. On the Democratic side, even though Kamala's policies were 1 trillion times better, there is no story, there is no narrative, right? So, in other words, what Hasan's point is, and those are good policies Bakari laid out, but let's keep it real. A tax credit is not going to hit as hard as universal health care. Everybody gets health care. It's not going to hit as hard as we're going to raise minimum wage. Everybody's getting a wage increase. It's not going to hit as hard as you are screwed right now because of billionaires and multinational corporations and the big money donors who have rigged the government in their favor and against you. I'm going to stand up and fight the billionaires and the donor class, and I'm going to return the power to the people and deliver you guys the things that you say you want. So, as I pointed out in the previous segment, there's actually data to back up Hasan's point here, right? This is the data. So, early on in the process, Kamala was leaning heavy into progressive economic issues. Capital gains tax, billionaire tax, corporate accountability, tax the rich, stuff like that, right? And then as time went on, the progressive economic issues fell off, and she started talking more broadly about the economy, right? Think wages, jobs, workers, unemployment, whatever, stock market type shit, more general stuff, small business related stuff. So it started out more populist, more progressive, then became less so as time went on, and became more general, almost sounding like a moderate Republican more as time went on. And to me, this is the biggest chart to show here. This is some data from Jacobin. They did an analysis of Kamala's rhetoric throughout the campaign. This is the big one right here. So at the very beginning, Kamala was really leaning into anti-elite rhetoric. In other words, she was doing much more of what Hasan wanted her to do, right? It was more bold policy stuff. The policy stuff was front and center, and there was more of an anti-elite narrative around it. Think of the ban on price gouging for groceries. So started out with way more anti-elite rhetoric than pro-democracy rhetoric. And then as time went on, the anti-elite rhetoric fell off a cliff, and at the end, she was just doing democracy stuff. So in other words, copying the Biden 2020 playbook of rule of law and the Constitution and democracy. Now, that's not to say that that stuff isn't important. It is important, and Trump is a threat to those things. But from an electoral perspective, the arguments that land better with voters, it's the anti-elite stuff. It's the anti-establishment stuff. And at the beginning, she was doing that, and she picked Tim Walz, who's very anti-establishment, very populist, progressive. And there was a brief moment there early on where she was up 7 points in a poll on Trump. 7 points. She ended up losing by 1.5. And as time went by, it was less of the progressive populist stuff, less of the anti-elite stuff and it became more democracy, copying the 2020 Joe Biden playbook. And so the result was she ended up losing. So what Bukhari is missing, the implication of what Bukhari is saying here is like, kind of like she did everything she could and it didn't work. That's kind of what his point is, right? Or there are other factors that Hasan's not taking into consideration, like race and gender, which effectively hurt her because people wouldn't vote for a black woman. These are like the implications of what Bukhari's saying. And to be fair, I don't think Hasan would say that was a non-factor. I don't think Hasan would say race and gender played no role whatsoever, right? But Bukhari's just kind of wrong that there's nothing she could have done different to win. I just think that's incorrect. And I think we need to learn the lessons for the future. And the reality is, look, Trump might be so horrible for so long that any Democrat with a fucking pulse wins. That's absolutely true. But then if you don't want the same old in terms of policies, and you really want to fix this country, you better hope that it's somebody who's actually anti-elite, actually anti-establishment, who's actually going to deliver on progressive populist policies, right? And so, again, Hasan's right on the macro point. Bukhari's not wrong. It's not like it's just policy. The reality is it's policy plus populist messaging and having a narrative and a story. And as time went on, she had no narrative, she had no story, and she pretty much dropped the anti-elite rhetoric. And that kind of doomed her, right? So that's the takeaway. God, it's a real shame, right? Because, I don't know, a guy like Bukhari Sellers, I don't know if he would ever admit what I'm saying here, right? It's easy to just take that clip of Hasan and react to it and say it's not just about policies. I agree, it's not just about policies. But it's like policies plus the populist progressive narrativizing. That's the big part, man, because we are a lot vibes-based. We are. And to just go down your checklist is one thing, even if the things are good and sound good, it's more fits in with human nature to have this grand narrative where you're at the center of it and you're representing the people, the forces of good against the forces of evil. But if you have no forces of evil and you don't represent that which is good and your voters don't represent that which is good, it's harder for people to get excited about that, right? And look, it's possible at the end of the day, Kamala is just not the one to deliver that message. But then that is her problem, and that's why I keep saying Jon Stewart 2028. Because Jon Stewart hits everything, right? He knows the narrative, he knows the story, he knows who the villains are, and you have to represent those popular policies with that narrative, right? And again, Kamala did have some good policies, but it wasn't tied with a narrative, and she didn't continue with the early on strategy, which was working well. A lot of the Biden team came in there and really screwed the pooch 1,000 times over. A lot of the Biden people came in there, they said, drop the weird stuff, drop the we're not going back stuff, stop leaning into the ban on price gouging stuff, talk more about democracy, do 17 events with Liz Cheney. And that's the other thing. I don't know if Bukhari is willing to reckon with the fact that that stuff certainly did not help and almost definitely hurt. Running around with Liz Cheney everywhere was a horrible idea. It's a horrible idea. It really undercuts your message if you're trying to say, Trump and the Republicans are a threat to democracy, and here I am campaigning with a Republican. It really does kind of undercut your message. And so, I think it was a much bigger problem. I'm going to go right-wing on the border. I'm going to talk about owning a Glock. I'm going to run around with Liz Cheney. I think that stuff hurt way more than it helped. And the evidence of that is, again, Trump got 94% of the Republican vote in 2020, and he got 94% of the Republican vote in 2024. And so that strategy just objectively didn't get them across the finish line. And what I want to prevent is Democrats from going, no, we need to go further in that direction in order to win. We need to be more pro-Republican. We need to be more neoliberal. We need to be less woke, right? I'm afraid of that. And that's sort of the direction a lot of commentators want to take us in. And it's important that we stand up against that. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.